Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Humans, A Monstrous History by Surekha Davies, narrated by Christina Delaine. Introduction. I spent my childhood watching too much Star Trek and have been searching for monsters and aliens ever since. They led me through grad school. They sustained me through adventures on the road. Being locked into a vault in the Vatican Library and balancing on a ladder in a Parisian basement while wrangling giant maps and directing the beam of a hot lamp, trying not to burn anything. Monsters climbed into my syllabi when I became a professor. They jostled together in my first book on the monstrous peoples that cartographers devised for maps during the age of European exploration. But the seed for Humans, A Monstrous History, was a chance visit to an astrobiology conference at the Library of Congress in 2014. At Preparing for Discovery, scholars discussed how societies might prepare for the possibility of finding life beyond Earth. I was then a fellow at the Kluge Center, working on my first book in the colossal Beaux-Arts-style Thomas Jefferson Library building across the street from the U.S. Capitol. The astrobiology conference was happening just downstairs from my office. The Kluge Fellows, from anthropologists to musicologists, were invited to attend. In one of the panels, scientists discussed how societies might contain extraterrestrial pathogens and build weapons to fight hostile aliens. But it seemed to me that they were missing a trick. In the Q&A session, up went my hand. I asked, what about preparing people on Earth for dealing with the discovery that they were not alone in the universe? How would that affect people whose religious beliefs appeared not to predict life beyond Earth? Wouldn't people panic? Wasn't there a risk of anarchy and looting in response to even an announcement that extraterrestrials had been found, or, worse, were on Earth? To prepare for alien encounters, shouldn't we be figuring out how to get along better with one another? As I worked through my questions, there were nods in the audience. But then the panel chair cut me off. He looked baffled and cross. My questions were not about weapons or germs, and so not something he wanted to think about. So he chose to condescend. He said that I had asked the wrong questions, that my observations were off topic. It was then that I realized that I was onto something. Not only did science lack some of the answers for how humanity should interact with life on Earth, but it was also insufficient for thinking about the cosmos. What I had to offer came, instead, from deep in the humanities, and that something involved monsters. Monsters. What? There are no monsters, but all of them are real. This is a book about monster making. The stories societies tell about who they think isn't normal or typical, the process of defining people as something outside normal categories, as something monstrous. When people hear the word monster, they tend to think of sinister things, vampires, zombies, and Frankenstein, or sociopaths and serial killers. But there are fun monsters, too, like the Muppets, and others that are somewhere between terrifying and amusing, like centaurs. What these real and fictional monsters share is a capacity to challenge or transcend ideas about typical bodies or behavior. Monsters are category breakers. Monsters are the work of the imagination. Monster, as I use it in this book, is a broad catch-all for any term, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral, that people use to define someone who falls across or outside the categories of normal people or beings in the world, as far as they understand them. If people and wolves are separate categories in the understanding of the universe, then the discovery of a werewolf would be the discovery of something abnormal or monstrous. As a hybrid of two regular categories, the werewolf is a monster. This kind of monster would be alarming to meet, and not simply because of its teeth. by showing that wolves and people are not entirely separate after all. A werewolf would reveal the limits of our categories and change how we thought about who or what humans really are. Monsters are ideas that show us things. They reveal the edge of types of being, or how far we can go before we stop being one thing and suddenly snap into another type of thing, like a light switch going from on to off, except that the monster is neither on nor off, but that seesaw space in between, where the light threatens to blow a fuse as it judders between settings. My capacious definition of monsters includes anyone who becomes labeled in ways that exclude them from the definition of normal. This process of labeling, of what I call monster making or monstrification, reveals the limits of the categories with which societies understand and organize the world and its peoples. In biology, monster used to work as a placeholder, with characteristics and a shape that allowed people to design techniques for filling in the gaps in knowledge. Today, monster has been replaced by phrases like unknown species or newly discovered species. There was a similar phenomenon in the mathematical sciences. Scientific papers and the notes of scientists were once filled with what they called demons, their label for unruly phenomena. This category allowed scientists to generate experiments to investigate the observations they could not yet explain. Both monsters and demons were shorthands that represented real phenomena that were, as yet, imperfectly known and beyond the observer's classificatory system. Monster making happens when people say that someone or something is weird or does not fit, whatever that means. It's what happens when people try to organize everyone and everything into neat little boxes. Whatever the shape of the boxes, there will usually be people who don't fit in them comfortably, if they fit in them at all. We can then make new boxes, reorganize everything in the old ones, or decide that boxes are so yesterday and throw them out without making new ones. We can even lump together all the awkward cases in a box of their own and label it monsters. Monster itself can be a term of classification, a brusque, dismissive shorthand for something I don't know what to do with. But monster making is also the act of making a value judgment, a form of name-calling with great power. Communities identify groups and individuals as monstrous, as transgressing the limits of normal bodies, beliefs, or behavior, to give their abstract fears and ideas a physical form and a potential solution. Assumptions about norms and monsters lie at the heart of how societies define and classify people. This book is an alternative history of humanity, one that uses the monster as a lens to refract into view hidden assumptions that inform ideas about nature, people, and society. Devastated by a death during childbirth, a person in 16th century Europe might blame the midwife. She might be a witch. Annoyed that your workers in the Caribbean keep wandering away from the back-breaking, poorly paid work required to bring in the harvest that keeps you in luxury? A 17th century European plantation owner might lobby for a new legal category of worker, enslaved black Africans defined as property, who belong to them and are required to do their bidding, and to whom horrific punishments may be meted out lawfully should they try to escape. Monstrified individuals and groups, the monsters of the archive, reveal something about the person or communities doing the naming, not the person or communities they name. Today's urgent questions about human rights, labor, wealth, health, technology, and climate justice contain traces from the pre-industrial past, assumptions about who counts as a person and what counts as natural. Across arenas ranging from gymnastics to policing, monster-making has profoundly shaped how we think about science, society, and humanity. We cannot fully understand the present or avoid making the same mistakes in the future without attending to the long and volatile history of monsters. This book tells the story of how the past 4 millennia of monster making created the world we live in today. Many of the examples come from the ancient Mediterranean, Europe and its empires, and the Americas, and reveal an alternative history of the West through those the West defined as monsters. I see monsters as portals through which to travel through space, time, and cultures to see where humanity may be heading next. This is not so much a history of monsters as a history through monsters. History through monsters. Humans, A Monstrous History, shows how people have defined, explained, and vilified otherness across the world through long, wild traditions of what I call monster making. Acts of monster making are fundamental to understanding how people have thought about, interacted with, and classified one another. Writing history involves making tough decisions about what stories to include. Whose lives, stories, agendas, and interpretations matter? This book holds in tension the lives and stories of many individuals and peoples who were seen in their time as outside or transgressing categories. At times, we can hear the voices of those who were the object of monstrification. But by and large, this book tracks not the monsters, but the monster labelers, the monster inventors or name-callers. It reveals the assumptions, agendas, and interpretations of those who saw others as monsters, and who actively framed them as less than or threats to an imagined normal or default. Humanity is presently hurtling toward a monster event horizon. Where people once made monsters of others, now increasing numbers of flesh and blood humans are losing rights to corporations or being surveilled or replaced by so-called AI. Humanity risks being pushed to the margins of the future, or perhaps thrown out of an airlock. How, then, do we live in an age when the corporeal human being is increasingly framed as the inconvenience, the monster? We need to be prepared for meeting the strange, on Earth or in outer space, with curiosity and empathy, as science writer Ed Young puts it in his writings about animals. And we also have to contend with the fact that the monster lurking in the shadows might be ourselves. 1. On the ecology of monsters. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's turn-of-the-19th century horror novel, Victor Frankenstein's loomingly tall monster was stitched together like a sewing class project gone fantastically wrong. The monster was nasty and ultimately, hopefully, imaginary. Like Bram Stoker's bloodthirsty Dracula scowling away in his musty castle at the end of that century, or the horrid thing you feared might be lurking under your bed as a child. These are the sorts of things that people often think of if you ask them what a monster is. The horror of Frankenstein's monster lay in its in-betweenness. Like a werewolf thumping, slinking, and baying through the night, straddling the boundary between human and animal, Frankenstein's monster straddled boundaries between dead and alive, and between one body and another. Monsters like this activate our imagination. They might go on a rampage or be some sort of existential threat. The bull-headed, human-bodied Minotaur of ancient Greek mythology embodied all the attributes of the loner threat monster. He languished in a labyrinth on the island of Crete, subsisting on a diet of take-out deliveries of bright young things sacrificed for his delectation. From creatures in ancient myths to serial killers in today's headlines, this sense of monster as a one-off, a loner, and a category problem is a powerful form of storytelling. But that's just a small part of the story of monsters and the history of humanity. People define what they mean by human by defining where they think human ends, at the monster. Monsters defined like this separate us, whoever that is, from the them of other beings who are supposedly not bulls, wolves, corpses. Calling in-between beings monsters reassures us that we, personally, aren't this weird or horrible. Only monsters are like that. We, instead, are supposedly straightforwardly ordinary humans, completely distinct from both animals and creepy things. But the definition of human is neither straightforward nor ordinary, nor is it universal or timeless. And the category or box called human is not entirely separate from the categories of other beings, not even from monsters. Depending on where you have lived and how you were raised, you may sort the beings of the world into very different boxes with no overlap, say plant life here, humans there, and monsters, whatever they are, somewhere else. Perhaps it even seems obvious what goes where, or you may be comfortable with the idea that a slippery slope connects humans to other sorts of beings, including monsters, beings that are neither one thing or another, or are even many things at once. If you think to be human is to be single, stable individuals or beings who end at their skin, then prepare to raise your eyebrows. I'd like us to look together at some of the ways in which people have understood the category of the human very differently, at human as a being on a continuum, capable of blending with, even into, their surroundings and other beings. Categories are conventions, and they are not universally agreed on. The boundary between human and the rest of the world and its beings, from what I'm going to call ecology, turns out to be blurry and permeable. Right at that edge between different categories are beings that people define, using a variety of terms, as monsters. Beings that challenge those categories because they do not entirely fit any of them, because they fit multiple categories, or because they transcend them all. In 1686, in a town in Oaxaca, southwestern Mexico, a certain Marcial de la Cruz, an indigenous man, confessed that he had accidentally murdered his wife, Catalina Maria. As he told it, the couple had been out for a walk when his wife had gone on ahead while he took a dip in a river. When he scurried to catch up, he spied a jaguar, crouched in readiness to attack. After calling on the Christian God and brandishing the rosary around his neck at the jaguar, he clubbed the creature. At that moment, a voice in his own language of Tichaza'a advised, "Cuckold, don't kill that woman." As the jaguar died, it morphed into his wife. After the death of his wife/the jaguar, Marcial de la Cruz fled the scene, only turning himself in for murdering his wife 2 years later. This act of involuntary manslaughter was not a unique predicament. Look in the inquisitorial archives of colonial Spanish America, and you'll find bundles of handwritten documents, witness statements, and reports from trials describing how a person who had injured or killed an animal turned out to have, in fact, murdered a person. Treatises about indigenous customs describe shapeshifters and individuals whose souls could flit between bodies. The 16th century Spanish Dominican friar Diego Duran described how an indigenous person in Mexico told him that a holy man had left the area because he was being persecuted by not one, but 2 Nahuali, or shapeshifters. The Mexica understood shapeshifting as part of how the cosmos worked. Beings in the visible and invisible worlds, from rocks and plants to gods, had dual natures. Competing, opposing qualities and predilections shaped their constantly shifting natures. This way of thinking enlarged and blended individual types of beings and made the boundary between humans and the rest of the beings in the world porous. People could absorb the powers of things and animals. Indeed, humans, animals, plants, rocks, mountains, and stars were all somewhat squishy. Under the right conditions, people could experience being something else. Since shape-shifting was part of the regular order of things, the distance between humans and ecology, The world beyond one's own body was small. This was not so for the 17th-century Catholic curate-turned-judge Hernando Ruiz de Alarcón. Raised in Tasco, also in southwest Mexico, he was posted to nearby Atenango. There he became so furious about indigenous beliefs, as far as he understood them, that he took it into his own hands to flog indigenous people who transgressed Catholic teachings. Becoming a one-man lynch mob was technically illegal under Spanish law, but when word of Ruiz de Alarcón's activities reached the Inquisition in New Spain, he got a promotion. Around 1617, the office of the Holy Inquisition appointed him to the role of ecclesiastical judge, responsible for informing the Inquisition of local instances of the persistence of indigenous beliefs and practices. The gnarliest problem that the Catholic Church faced was syncretism, the practice by which indigenous people understood Catholic teachings as analogues of their existing beliefs, or as add-ons that did not require them to give up indigenous beliefs or practices. In the course of his now official duty as local persecutor-in-chief, Ruiz de Alarcón penned a scathing catalogue of what he called local heathen superstitions and customs. The treatise on the heathen superstitions and customs that today live among the Indians native to this New Spain had issues with everything from the indigenous way of blurring categories, their belief that clouds are angels and gods worthy of being adored, to their custom of consuming mind-altering substances like tobacco and peyote, a cactus, to have visions. As for the Nahuali, Ruiz de Alarcón concluded that the parents of such a person had made a pact with the devil, one that enabled them to wield unnatural powers in the world. A great many of today's ideas that seem like laws of the universe in one setting look arbitrary for people with different cultural or scientific frameworks. The history of how cultures have drawn the map of life, of where they place themselves in relation to the web of ecology, beings, things, and relationships, reveals where people drew the boundary between human and the rest, if they drew one at all. The colonial-era clash of indigenous and Catholic ideas reveals that, to understand how cultures have defined what they mean by human, we should pay attention to ideas about in-between beings, monsters. As we'll see over the course of this book, how people define where human ends and other sorts of beings begin has shaped how people interact and how they act on the world around them for millennia. And to find the roots of the ideas that prompted Catholic missionaries and jurists to condemn indigenous beliefs about shapeshifters, that's how far back we need to go. Humors. Geographers and naturalists in ancient Greece and Rome identified two broad sorts of monsters. One sort was the one-off monstrous birth, like a two-headed calf. This type of monster could appear anywhere and was a divine sign of someone's misbehavior, a portent of doom, a sign of impending punishment sent by the gods, or an accident of nature. But there was another sort of monstrosity, one that appeared not as the one-off difference of a single individual, but as a universal feature across an entire community that shared an unusual trait, like having their eyes below their shoulders or possessing an enormous lower lip. Ancient Greek and Roman thinkers interpreted confused stories about distant peoples and their practices as evidence of what they called monstrous peoples, entire communities of, to Greeks, misshapen or misbehaving individuals linked by their geography and genealogy. In ancient Mediterranean thought, people were susceptible to the environment before birth and during the course of their lives. Afro-Eurasian physicians were influenced by the teachings of the 5th century BCE physician and naturalist Hippocrates, and later, by the 3rd century CE physician and surgeon Galen. These thinkers understood ecology to shape people's bodies, health, and temperaments, what might today be called personalities, by affecting the 4 humors or essential substances that made up their bodies: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. People's minds and bodies were apparently malleable. Their humors were altered by the environment, by airs, waters, medicaments, foodstuffs, seasons, the alignment of stars and planets, the climate in which they were born and brought up, the climates they experienced throughout their lives, and even their physical activities. Well into the 17th century and the disputes over shapeshifters in Spanish-American colonies, scientists and medical practitioners in Europe understood the bodies, behaviors, and health of entire societies as the product of a dialogue between internal humors and ecology. Humoral thinking opened up the possibility that extreme environments would contain alarming life forms. Entire societies might be so denatured by their surroundings that they were monstrous, fundamentally different somehow from normal people. Perhaps the most influential ancient authority on monstrous peoples was naturalist Pliny the Elder, 23 to 79 CE, a Roman of such insatiable curiosity that he ended up getting killed by Mount Vesuvius when he went to check out the eruption. Before his untimely end, Pliny wrote a mammoth 37-volume treatise on the descriptive sciences, integrating the study of everything from human cultures to the Earth's mineral resources. His Natural History served as a field guide for later geographers and naturalists in Europe for centuries, well into the era of European oceanic voyages and empires. Pliny provided a whistle-stop tour of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Europe, at least of those about whom he had any intel. There are endless tidbits about local ecology, triumphs of engineering, and customs. In northwest Greece, noxious fumes emanate from parts of the ground in Epirus, and a 1,000-foot bridge spans the Acheron River in Thesprotia. In the Dead Sea, the bodies of animals do not sink in its waters, even bulls and camels floating. Here and there, Pliny revealed his sources. He learned about India from Greek authors who had stayed as guests with the Indian kings, and from writers who accompanied Alexander the Great on his expedition to conquer India. Pliny surmised that extreme climates and environments brought monstrous peoples into being. The most fertile regions generated people with exaggerated attributes, such as giants or the Panotii, beings with very large ears. Desert regions caused bodies to lack things and were thus the home of pygmies, who lacked height. Troglodytes found their environment so unappealing that they attempted to avoid it entirely by living in caves. He featured peoples with customs he considered to be spectacular. Beyond the Rippean Mountains, the Hyperboreans apparently lived extremely long and idyllic lives in a temperate climate. They died only when they jumped from a certain rock into the sea, once they had had their fill of a life of luxury. By contrast, the Atlas tribe was said to have fallen below the level of human civilization, lacking names for themselves and constantly cursing the rising and setting sun. The region most densely populated with unusual peoples was Ethiopia, asserted Pliny. It was, he surmised, not surprising that Ethiopia contained animals and human monstrosities, considering the capacity of fire to mold their bodies and carve their outlines. Some of these beings supposedly had neither lips nor tongues. Others communicated through gestures rather than speech. Some did not know fire. In Book 7 of the Natural History, Pliny shifted from talking about animals to talking about people. He asserted that India and parts of Ethiopia especially teem with marvels. By contrast, Europe, as Pliny had assured the reader earlier, not only nourished and raised that people which has conquered all other nations, but was also the most beauteous portion of the earth. Implicitly, the farther you traveled from the eastern Mediterranean, the more monsters you were likely to meet. A key monster-making zone for ancient Afro-Eurasian thinkers, and the medieval geographers who followed, was the equator, since they knew that the Earth became hotter when they traveled south through the northern hemisphere. Some geographers even hypothesized that nothing could live south of the region of great heat that engirdled the equator, a region known as the torrid zone. Others
Sample complete. Ready to continue?